To Dad, my son Daniel said, lifting his wine glass at the head of my dining table, who made sure Mom would never have to worry about a thing. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. I was 71 years old, seated in the same oak-back chair I had used for 35 years, my hands folded neatly over a linen napkin I had ironed that afternoon, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a guest in my own home. The chandelier above us cast a warm yellow light over the polished mahogany table, over the roast chicken I had basted every 20 minutes, over the crystal glasses that once belonged to my mother, and yet something about that toast felt cold. Daniel smiled across the table at his wife, Rachel, and she returned the look with a small, satisfied nod that almost no one else would have noticed. But I noticed. I have always noticed the small things. Thomas, my husband, used to say that was my gift. 3 months had passed since we buried him on a breezy afternoon in early April, the American flag at the cemetery snapping gently in the wind, and since then the house had felt too large, too quiet, too aware of its own echoes. Daniel and Rachel had started coming by more often. At first I thought it was grief drawing us together. They offered to help with paperwork, with utility bills, with loose ends. I was grateful, or at least I told myself I was. That night, as the scent of rosemary and butter lingered in the air, I studied my son's face while he spoke. He looked confident, polished, like the corporate attorney he had become. Dad planned ahead, he continued, setting his glass down. Everything's been handled. Everything. The word pressed against my ribs. I hadn't been part of any recent meeting. I hadn't signed anything new. Thomas and I had always reviewed our documents together at the kitchen counter on Sunday afternoons, reading every line twice. He would slide his glasses down his nose and say, "Margaret, nothing moves without you knowing." I could almost hear him then, his steady voice threading through the silence between Daniel's sentences. Rachel reached for the serving spoon before I could and began distributing mashed potatoes onto plates as if she had memorized the rhythm of my table. "It's such a relief," she said lightly, "knowing the future is secure." Secure for whom? I wondered. I kept my expression soft. I have learned that composure reveals more than confrontation. I took a small sip of water and felt the coolness settle in my throat. Outside, the late summer air clung to the windows. Inside, the conversation drifted to real estate markets and interest rates, to phrases like asset allocation and streamlining properties. No one asked my opinion. No one asked how I was sleeping in a bed that still carried the faint scent of Thomas's cologne. When Daniel finally looked at me, his smile was gentle but distant. "You don't have to worry anymore, Mom," he said. Worry had never frightened me. Ignorance did. I glanced at the framed photograph on the buffet behind him. Thomas in his navy blazer, standing in front of the lake house we bought 20 years ago after saving every spare dollar. He had insisted the deed be structured carefully. For protection, he said back then. Protection from what? I never asked. Perhaps from moments exactly like this. I set my fork down deliberately. The silver made a soft click against the china. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. If everything had been handled, I needed to understand by whom. I had spent decades balancing checkbooks down to the penny, stretching grocery budgets, planning college tuition, paying off a 30-year mortgage one steady payment at a time. I was not a woman who drifted through her own finances. And yet tonight, at my own dinner table, I realized decisions may have been made in rooms I was never invited into. Rachel laughed at something Daniel whispered, and I noticed again how quickly they shared looks before speaking, as if rehearsed. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps grief makes ordinary conversations sound suspicious. But as the plates emptied and the candles burned lower, I understood one quiet truth. If my husband had indeed made sure I would never have to worry, then I intended to find out exactly how. And if someone had interpreted his protection differently than he intended, they were about to discover that I had inherited more than his house and his savings. I had inherited his patience. The next morning I woke before sunrise, as I had done for most of my adult life, and lay still for a moment listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of a garbage truck moving along Maple Street. The other half of the bed remained perfectly smooth, the pillow untouched, and I pressed my palm lightly against the cool sheet where Thomas used to sleep. 3 months was not long enough to erase habits formed over 4 decades. I rose slowly, tied my robe at the waist, and made my way to the kitchen where the coffee maker blinked 12 o'clock because Daniel had unplugged it the night before to plug in his laptop charger without asking. It was a small thing. A very small thing. I reset the clock, measured 2 careful scoops of ground coffee into the filter, and waited for the familiar gurgle to fill the silence. Outside, the lawn shimmered with early dew, each blade trimmed precisely to 2.5 inches because Thomas had believed consistency mattered. I carried my mug to the dining room table and opened the leather binder that held our financial documents. The edges of the pages were worn from years of use. Thomas and I had always kept everything in order: life insurance policies, property deeds, retirement accounts, trust agreements. I began flipping through them one by one, not in panic, not in anger, but in methodical review. The trust document felt thinner than I remembered. I paused. The page numbers were sequential, yet something in the texture told me that copies had been made recently. I traced the signature line with my finger. My own name was there, dated 5 years ago. Thomas's signature sat beside mine in his careful blue ink. There was no amendment attached. No recent addendum. I closed the binder and carried it to the kitchen counter where sunlight had begun to spill through the east-facing window. Daniel had mentioned everything was handled. Handled suggested action. Action required documentation. I opened the drawer where I kept the safe deposit key. It was still there, taped beneath the wooden insert exactly where Thomas and I had agreed it would remain. That detail steadied me. After breakfast, I drove my silver sedan to Whitmore Community Bank, the same branch we had used for 22 years. The parking lot was nearly empty at 9 in the morning, and the American flag by the entrance moved gently in the breeze. I walked inside and greeted Susan at the front desk. She had attended Thomas's memorial service and hugged me tightly afterward. Her expression softened when she saw me. I requested access to our safe deposit box. The process was routine. Signature verification. Identification. A quiet walk down the carpeted hallway to the vault. When the metal drawer slid open, I felt an unexpected calm. Inside were the original trust documents, property deeds, and a sealed envelope marked in Thomas's handwriting. In the event Margaret ever feels uncertain. My throat tightened, but my hands remained steady. I did not open the envelope yet. Instead, I compared the original trust copy to the one in my binder at home. The wording was identical. No new pages. No hidden clauses. If something had changed, it had not happened here. I thanked the bank manager and returned to my car, sitting behind the steering wheel for several minutes before turning the engine on. The air conditioning hummed softly as I considered the dinner conversation again. Rachel's quick glance at Daniel. The word streamline. The confidence in his voice. They believed something had been settled. The question was what, and by whom. I pulled into my driveway just as a delivery truck passed by, and for the first time since that toast, I allowed myself a thin, private smile. If they were certain everything had been arranged, then they would not expect me to verify it. And verification, I have learned, is where truth begins. That afternoon, I finally opened the envelope Thomas had labeled in his careful handwriting, and I did it at the kitchen counter where we had always stood side by side reviewing paperwork, the late sunlight stretching across the granite like a quiet witness. Inside was a single letter, folded twice, dated 6 months before he passed away. Margaret, it began, if you are reading this, it means something does not feel right. Trust that instinct. I sat down slowly, the wooden chair scraping softly against the tile. He went on to explain that he had reviewed our estate plan one last time after Daniel mentioned interest in restructuring assets for tax efficiency. Thomas wrote that he had agreed to listen but had not signed any changes, not without me present. He reminded me that the primary trust remained irrevocable and that any amendment would require both of our signatures. While we were alive. I read that sentence twice. Any amendment would require both of our signatures. My breathing steadied. After finishing the letter, I placed it carefully back into the envelope and slid it into my purse. If no amendment existed in the original documents and no change had been recorded at the bank, then whatever Daniel believed had been handled must have occurred elsewhere. I drove home from the bank earlier with calm curiosity. Now that curiosity sharpened into quiet focus. The next logical step was to review recent account activity. I logged into our joint online banking portal using the password Thomas and I had created years ago, a combination of our wedding anniversary and the street number of our first apartment. The transaction history loaded slowly. Utility payments. property tax installment, routine withdrawals for groceries, and insurance premiums. Then I saw it. 2 months ago, a new external account had been linked for transfers. The name was abbreviated, but the initials matched Rachel's maiden name. The transfers were modest, each under $5,000, labeled consulting reimbursement. I had never authorized consulting services. I clicked into the details and found that the authorization form had been submitted electronically, using Daniel's email address. The signature field contained a digital version of Thomas's name. My pulse did not quicken. Instead, I felt a cool clarity settle over me. Thomas had been hospitalized during that period, sedated at times, certainly not managing electronic forms. I printed the transaction records and placed them neatly into a folder. I did not confront anyone. Confrontation closes doors. Documentation opens them. Later that evening, Daniel called to check in. His tone was light, almost cheerful. He asked if I needed help with yard maintenance before fall arrived. I thanked him and said the lawn service was scheduled as usual. There was a pause on the line. He then mentioned that he and Rachel were meeting with a financial advisor the following week to discuss family planning. Family planning. I had not been invited. After we ended the call, I walked through the house slowly, noticing details that once felt comforting but now felt revealing. The study door had been slightly ajar the last time they visited. The filing cabinet drawer did not close as smoothly as it once did. I opened it and found a thin folder labeled Draft Restructure Proposal, addressed to Daniel and Rachel. My name appeared only in the introductory paragraph, described as dependent beneficiary. Dependent. I stood very still, the paper trembling just slightly in my hand. For decades I had balanced household budgets, negotiated refinancing rates, and managed investments with care. Dependent was not a word that belonged to me. I replaced the folder exactly where I found it and closed the drawer with measured precision. If they believed I was unaware, then that belief was my advantage. I returned to the kitchen, brewed a fresh cup of coffee even though it was nearly 8 in the evening, and spread the printed transaction pages across the table. Each line told a story. Each date created a timeline. And as the house settled into nighttime quiet, I realized that whatever they had attempted to handle had left fingerprints. And fingerprints, once seen, cannot be unseen. The following morning, I did not rush to make calls or send messages. Urgency is often mistaken for strength, but I have learned that timing carries more weight than volume. I placed the printed transaction records and the restructure proposal into a slim navy folder and set it beside my purse. Then I did what I have always done when uncertainty tries to settle into my home. I cleaned. I polished the kitchen counters until the granite reflected the overhead lights. I vacuumed the living room rug in steady lines. I opened the windows to let in the early September air, cool and crisp at 62 degrees, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. Control begins with small order. By late morning, I drove to the office of Harold Benton, the attorney who had drafted our original estate plan. His building stood 3 stories tall in the downtown district, brick facade, brass lettering by the door. I had not been inside since Thomas and I finalized the trust years ago. The receptionist recognized my name and offered a sympathetic smile. Harold himself emerged from his office within minutes, his silver hair neatly combed, his handshake firm but gentle. We sat across from one another at a wide oak desk, and I placed the folder between us without dramatics. I explained what I had discovered in measured detail. The external transfers, the electronic authorization, the proposal labeling me dependent beneficiary. Harold listened without interruption, only adjusting his glasses once as he reviewed the documents. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Margaret," he said carefully, "no amendment to your trust has been filed with this office. No modification was executed under proper legal procedure. If someone attempted to redirect funds electronically without valid authority, that is a separate matter entirely." His tone remained professional, but I noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. He asked for copies, which I provided. He assured me that the irrevocable trust structure required dual consent during Thomas's lifetime, and that after his passing, the trust became fixed according to the original terms. Any consulting reimbursement drawn from joint accounts would require documented authorization from both trustees. Both trustees. I nodded slowly. Daniel had been granted limited power of attorney during Thomas's hospitalization, but that authority was restricted to medical decisions and temporary bill payments. It did not extend to asset reallocation. Harold confirmed this after checking the file. The digital signature used during Thomas's sedation period would be questionable at best. I did not express anger. I did not accuse. I simply absorbed the clarity of legal language settling around me like armor. Before I left, Harold asked whether I wished to initiate immediate corrective action. I shook my head. Not yet. I would prefer to understand the full extent first. He respected that. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the pavement to nearly 80 degrees. I sat in my car for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, considering the path forward. Confrontation would be easy. Evidence was accumulating. But easy solutions rarely produce lasting truth. That evening, Daniel texted to say he and Rachel would stop by on Sunday to review long-term housing options. The phrase lingered in my mind. Housing options implied change. Change implied movement. Movement required leverage. I replied that Sunday would be perfect and suggested dinner at 6:30, the same time as before. When I set my phone down, I felt neither fear nor hesitation. I returned to the dining room and adjusted the framed photograph of Thomas so it faced directly toward the table. His steady eyes seemed to meet mine. We had built this house together, board by board, payment by payment. Protection, he once called it. As I turned off the lights for the evening, I understood that protection is not merely a legal structure. It is awareness. And awareness, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. Sunday arrived with a sky so clear it looked freshly washed, the temperature settling at 74 degrees by late afternoon, just warm enough to leave the windows slightly open. I began preparing dinner at 4 o'clock sharp, not because I needed the time, but because ritual steadies the mind. I seasoned the roast with thyme and black pepper, peeled potatoes in even strokes, and set the table with the same crystal glasses that had reflected Daniel's earlier toast. The navy folder rested inside the drawer of the buffet, within reach but out of sight. I did not rehearse what I would say. Rehearsal creates emotion. I wanted clarity. At exactly 6:25, their sedan pulled into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as Daniel stepped out first, straightening his jacket, Rachel following with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. They entered with practiced warmth. Daniel kissed my cheek. Rachel complimented the scent of dinner. I returned their smiles and asked about traffic. We sat. Plates were passed. The rhythm felt familiar, almost comforting. Daniel began the conversation casually, discussing market trends, rising property taxes, and the advantages of consolidating assets for efficiency. Rachel nodded along, occasionally glancing at the portfolio beside her plate. I listened without interruption, cutting my roast into precise pieces. After a few minutes, Daniel cleared his throat. He explained that maintaining a house of nearly 3,000 square feet might become burdensome for someone living alone. He spoke gently, carefully, as if delivering advice rather than direction. Rachel opened her portfolio and slid a printed brochure across the table toward me. A photograph of a modern condominium complex stared up from glossy paper. Amenities listed in bold type included fitness center, secured parking, and community activities for active adults. I traced the edge of the brochure with one finger, but did not open it. Daniel continued, outlining a proposal to sell the house, while the market remained favorable. He assured me that proceeds could be reinvested into diversified accounts under his guidance. Under his guidance. The phrase lingered between us like steam rising from a cup of tea. I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate. Then I reached into the buffet drawer and withdrew the navy folder. The movement was slow enough to feel natural. I laid the folder on the table but did not open it yet. Daniel's expression flickered, just briefly. Rachel's hand tightened around her glass. I began speaking softly, asking a simple question about the consulting reimbursements drawn from our joint account 2 months ago. Daniel hesitated, then explained that minor adjustments had been made to streamline estate matters during Thomas's hospitalization. Rachel added that everything had been authorized electronically. I nodded. Then I opened the folder and slid the printed transaction records across the table beside Harold Benton's written confirmation of trust terms. I pointed to the dates, to the digital signature, to the clause requiring dual consent. Silence settled in the room. The ticking of the wall clock grew louder than it had ever seemed. Daniel leaned forward, scanning the pages. Rachel's posture stiffened, but she said nothing. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked for clarification regarding how a sedated man could provide valid electronic authorization. Daniel's composure faltered, just slightly. He spoke about urgency and administrative confusion. Rachel attempted to redirect the discussion toward future housing plans. I closed the folder gently. Housing can be discussed later, I said evenly. For now, I would prefer that no further financial decisions be made without my direct participation and written consent verified through Harold's office. My tone remained calm, almost conversational. I lifted my water glass and took a measured sip. The balance of the room had shifted, not through confrontation, but through documentation. Daniel finally nodded, slowly, as if recalibrating a strategy. Rachel's smile did not return. Outside, the evening air cooled, and a breeze moved through the open windows. Inside, I understood something essential. They had expected resistance to be emotional. They had prepared for tears, perhaps even confusion. They had not prepared for patience paired with evidence. As dinner concluded, I gathered the plates without haste. Protection, I realized, is not loud. It is deliberate. And deliberate strength has a way of changing the direction of a room without ever raising its voice. After they left that night, the house felt different, not emptier, but clearer, as if a fog had lifted from the corners of the ceiling and the edges of the furniture. I rinsed the dishes slowly, stacking each plate with care, listening to the faint hum of the dishwasher once it began its cycle. The folder remained on the counter, closed. Steady. I did not feel victorious. I felt alert. There is a difference. The following morning Daniel called earlier than usual. His voice carried a careful neutrality, the kind professionals use when they are recalculating. He said he had reviewed the documents again and admitted that perhaps certain transfers had been processed too quickly during a stressful time. He described it as an administrative misunderstanding. I allowed him to finish without interruption. When he asked what I intended to do next, I told him simply that I had scheduled a formal review with Harold Benton to ensure full compliance moving forward. There was a brief silence on the line, just long enough to confirm that this had not been part of their plan. Later that afternoon I met with Harold again, this time to discuss protective adjustments rather than reactive ones. We reviewed the trust language in detail. He suggested adding a third-party co-trustee for oversight, someone neutral, perhaps the bank itself. I considered this carefully. Trust, once strained, should not be left to assumption. We drafted preliminary documents that would require any future asset movement above $2,000 to receive written authorization from both myself and the institutional co-trustee. Harold also advised sending a formal notice to the financial advisor Daniel had mentioned, clarifying that no restructuring discussions were to proceed without my direct involvement. The notice was precise, respectful, and unmistakable. I signed it without hesitation. By Wednesday, certified letters had been mailed. That evening Daniel arrived alone, without Rachel. He stood in the living room with his hands loosely clasped, looking younger than his 42 years for a moment. He said he had not intended to sideline me. He said he believed he was protecting me from complexity. I studied his face, searching for the boy who once built model airplanes at the kitchen table. Protection does not remove someone from decisions that define their own life, I told him quietly. Protection includes them. He nodded slowly. He did not argue. Before leaving, he asked whether the house would still be discussed. I answered that housing discussions would occur when I chose, not when market conditions dictated. The difference between urgency and pressure is subtle, but important. After he left, I walked through each room of the house with deliberate attention. The hardwood floors creaked gently under my steps, familiar and reassuring. I paused in the study and opened the filing cabinet once more. The restructure proposal was still there, untouched since Sunday. I removed it and placed it in my folder for safekeeping, not as evidence of betrayal, but as documentation of assumption. Outside, the evening temperature dipped to 68 degrees, and the first signs of autumn colored the maple tree near the driveway. Change is not always destructive. Sometimes it clarifies roles. By Friday afternoon, Harold called to confirm that the bank had agreed to serve as co-trustee, effective immediately upon filing. The paperwork would be finalized within 10 business days. I thanked him and set the phone down gently. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt vulnerable. It felt structured. At dinner that night, I set one place at the table for myself and lit a single candle. The flame burned steady, without flicker. I understood then that strength is not measured by confrontation, nor by how loudly one defends a boundary. It is measured by how clearly that boundary is defined. And mine, at last, had been drawn in ink that could not be erased. The paperwork was finalized the following Tuesday, just before noon, when the bank confirmed in writing that it had been formally appointed as co-trustee. I printed the confirmation email and placed it in the Navy folder alongside the rest of the documents, aligning the edges carefully before closing it. Structure brings quiet confidence. That afternoon, Rachel called for the first time since Sunday. Her voice carried a brightness that felt slightly rehearsed, as though she had practiced it before dialing. She asked whether Daniel had mentioned that they were still exploring housing options for me and emphasized how much easier life could be in a managed community. I listened without interruption, allowing her words to settle into the space between us. When she finished, I told her calmly that any discussion about my living arrangements would begin and end with my decision. There was a pause long enough to register surprise. She shifted the subject quickly, asking whether I would be attending a small dinner gathering they planned for the weekend. I accepted, not because I felt obligated, but because clarity sometimes requires proximity. On Saturday evening, I arrived at their home at precisely 6:30. The driveway lights illuminated trimmed hedges and freshly sealed concrete. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of vanilla candles. A few colleagues of Daniel's were present, along with a financial advisor I recognized from the brochure Rachel had shown me. Introductions were made politely. I took note of the advisor's expression when he realized I was not only present, but fully aware. During dinner, the conversation drifted toward investment strategies and multi-generational planning. The advisor spoke about efficiency and consolidation. Rachel nodded in agreement, occasionally glancing toward Daniel as if waiting for reinforcement. When the discussion turned subtly toward my house, I set my fork down and spoke in an even tone. I explained that the trust structure had been formally reinforced with institutional oversight, and that any proposal regarding asset movement would require compliance with its terms. The advisor's posture shifted. He asked whether he should coordinate directly with me moving forward. I answered yes. The word was simple, but it altered the room. Daniel remained quiet, observing the recalibration. Rachel's smile tightened at the corners. No one argued. No one challenged the statement. The topic moved on. Later, as guests filtered into the living room, Daniel approached me privately. He admitted that he had underestimated the legal permanence of the original trust. He said he believed modernization would benefit everyone. I told him modernization does not override consent. He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. On the drive home, the night air cooled to 65 degrees, and the road stretched ahead beneath streetlights casting soft amber circles on the pavement. I did not feel resentment. I felt resolve. The following week, Harold informed me that the bank had completed its internal review of the prior electronic transfers. The funds would be returned to the primary account pending clarification of authorization. I did not celebrate. Correction is not victory. It is restoration. That evening, I walked through my house again, pausing at the window overlooking the backyard where Thomas once built a wooden swing for Daniel. The grass shimmered under the porch light. I realized that what had changed was not only the paperwork. It was perception. They no longer viewed me as a dependent beneficiary of their management. They saw the structure that surrounded me, and more importantly, the intention behind it. Protection had shifted from silent assumption to visible boundary. And visible boundaries, once drawn, tend to hold. 2 weeks passed with a steadiness that felt earned, rather than accidental. The bank's formal acknowledgement arrived by certified mail on a quiet Thursday morning, confirming the return of the transferred funds and the activation of the co-trustee oversight. I signed the receipt, closed the front door, and stood for a moment in the entryway, listening to the soft ticking of the hallway clock. Restoration does not make noise. It settles in gradually, like sunlight shifting across a hardwood floor. That afternoon, Daniel requested to meet again, this time at my house, just the three of us. I agreed and set the table without ceremony. No crystal glasses, no elaborate roast, just simple porcelain plates and baked salmon with lemon, the kind of meal that requires no performance. They arrived at 6:30 sharp. Rachel's expression was composed, but there was a new calculation behind her eyes. Daniel looked tired, as though the weight of recent weeks had finally registered. We sat, There was no small talk. Daniel began by acknowledging that the restructuring proposal had moved too quickly and without sufficient transparency. He used words like oversight and assumption. Rachel added that they believed they were planning efficiently for long-term stability. I let them finish. Then I spoke plainly. Stability is not created by excluding the person whose life is being reorganized. It is created by inclusion and consent. My tone remained level. I was not scolding. I was clarifying. I explained that the co-trustee structure would remain in place indefinitely. Any future discussions about property, investments, or relocation would begin with me, not around me. Rachel inhaled as if preparing to object, then paused. Daniel nodded slowly. He asked whether I still intended to stay in the house long-term. I answered that I would remain as long as it felt like home. Decisions about downsizing, if they ever occurred, would be made because I desired change, not because someone calculated equity. Silence followed, but it was not tense. It was recalibrating. After dinner, Daniel lingered in the living room, while Rachel stepped outside to take a call. He studied the framed photographs on the mantel, stopping at one of him at age 8, standing beside Thomas with a fishing rod nearly taller than he was. I thought I was helping, he said quietly. I know, I replied. Help becomes control when it forgets who it is meant to serve. He absorbed that without defense. When Rachel returned, her posture was measured, almost cautious. She thanked me for dinner and mentioned that she respected the boundaries now in place. The word respected felt deliberate. I walked them to the door. The night air carried the first true chill of the season, dipping below 60 degrees. As their car disappeared down the street, I did not feel triumph. I felt alignment. Inside, the house seemed to breathe more easily. I extinguished the kitchen light and paused by the window overlooking the backyard. The maple tree had begun shedding a few early leaves, each one drifting downward without urgency. Change, I realized, does not always require rupture. Sometimes it requires structure strong enough to hold steady while others adjust. I returned to the dining room and straightened the chairs. The table no longer felt like a stage. It felt like mine again. And in that quiet ownership, I understood that everything had indeed changed, not because of one statement or one document, but because I had chosen to define the terms under which my life would proceed. Autumn settled in fully by mid-October, the mornings cooling to 55 degrees and the afternoons carrying that soft golden light that makes even familiar rooms feel new. The house had grown quieter in a different way now, not with the silence of absence, but with the calm of order restored. Daniel began calling once a week, not to suggest adjustments, but to ask how I was sleeping, whether the maple tree had lost all its leaves, whether I needed help replacing the porch light. Rachel's tone, when she visited, had shifted from strategic to measured. She no longer arrived with brochures or portfolios. She arrived with dessert. Change, I have learned, does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives in subtler gestures. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel asked if we could sit at the dining table and talk without paperwork between us. I agreed. The table looked as it always had, polished, steady, anchored beneath the chandelier Thomas installed himself 20 years ago. Daniel rested his hands flat on the wood and said he had been thinking about what protection truly meant. He admitted that when his father once told him, years ago, that everything would be taken care of, he assumed that meant he would eventually step into control. He believed responsibility required authority. I listened carefully. Then I told him something Thomas had said to me not long before he passed away. He had told me that taking care of someone does not mean taking over their life. It means standing beside them while they steer their own course. Daniel absorbed that in silence. The idea seemed to land more deeply now than it ever could have during a toast or a hurried explanation. Rachel joined us midway through the conversation, setting a plate of apple pie on the table. She listened without interruption. When Daniel finished speaking, she said quietly that she had grown up in a family where financial security was fragile and control felt like safety. I understood that. Fear often disguises itself as efficiency. I told her that security built on exclusion eventually fractures trust, but security built on transparency strengthens it. The room felt lighter after that, not because everything had been forgiven, but because everything had been named. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small but meaningful shifts. When the financial advisor sent an email, it was addressed to me first. When property tax notices arrived, Daniel asked whether I wanted assistance reviewing them rather than assuming he would handle them. Rachel stopped referring to the house as an asset and began calling it home again. The co-trustee structure remained firmly in place, not as a barrier, but as a reminder. Boundaries, once drawn, become part of the architecture. One evening I stood by the window watching the last leaves fall from the maple tree, drifting gently onto the lawn Thomas once trimmed so precisely. I did not feel the need to guard every movement anymore. Structure had replaced suspicion. I realized then that the real change had not occurred in a bank vault or a legal document. It had occurred in perception. Daniel no longer saw himself as the quiet architect of my future. He saw himself as my son again. And I no longer felt like a dependent beneficiary of someone else's planning. I felt like the steward of my own life, as I always had been. The dining table remained where it had always stood, solid and familiar. Conversations around it carried a different weight now, not heavy, but intentional. And in that intention, I understood something simple and enduring. Care is not measured by how much control one holds. It is measured by how much respect one is willing to give.